The courthouse doors closed behind me with a sound like a verdict of their own. And before I'd even reached the bottom step, Dean was there blocking the path, his shadow falling over me the way it used to fall over every room he entered. "Don't ever set foot in my house again," he said, loud enough for the cameras to catch it, loud enough for the reporters to lean in with their phones already recording. He wanted the world to see a broken woman standing in the cold. What he didn't know was that I had been waiting 22 years for this exact moment, and I had never once felt more prepared in my life. I want to tell you how we got here because nothing about this story is as simple as the headlines made it look. I met Dean Ramsay when I was 23, waiting tables at a diner 2 blocks from the community college where I was finishing my accounting degree at night. He was loud in the way ambitious young men are loud, full of ideas that outran his bank account by miles. And he had this way of looking at you like you were the only person who mattered. I fell for that look. I fell for the plans he sketched on napkins for the garage he rented with money he didn't have, for the version of the future he described so vividly I could almost touch it. What people don't understand, what they never bothered to ask, is that Ramsay Technologies wasn't built by Dean alone. I was the one who sat up until 3 in the morning building the first financial models. I was the one who walked into 4 different banks and got turned down 3 times before I finally convinced a loan officer named Walter Higgins to take a chance on us. I found our first investor at a Rotary Club breakfast, cornering him by the coffee urn, because I'd read every article he'd ever written about early-stage manufacturing. I wrote half of that original business plan, sitting at our kitchen table with a baby monitor next to my elbow because our daughter was 6 months old, and Dean was already traveling, already becoming the face people saw in magazines. I didn't mind, not at first. Someone had to run the meetings and shake the hands, and Dean was good at that. I told myself we were a team, that it didn't matter whose name appeared on the press releases as long as we both knew the truth. I believed that for a long time, longer than I should have. The company grew the way fires grow, slowly and then all at once. Within a decade, Ramsay Technologies had gone from a garage with 2 folding tables to a campus with its own parking structure. Dean's photograph appeared on the cover of a business magazine with the headline, "The Self-Made Visionary." I remember reading that at our kitchen counter, the same counter where I'd built the spreadsheets that made his vision possible, and saying nothing. I told myself it was just marketing. I told myself the truth didn't need to be printed to be real, but something shifted in Dean after that cover story. I watched it happen in small increments, the way you watch a tide come in without noticing exactly when your feet get wet. He stopped asking my opinion in strategy meetings. He started introducing me at company events as my wife instead of my co-founder, a distinction that sounds small until you've lived inside it for years. He began surrounding himself with people who agreed with him, replacing seasoned executives who remembered where the company came from with younger hires who only knew the legend Dean had built around himself. I noticed, of course I noticed, I am not the kind of woman who misses things. There was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because it was trash day, and I was rolling the bins to the curb when I saw Dean's calendar open on the kitchen tablet. A meeting scheduled with a divorce attorney's office downtown. No explanation, no conversation, just an appointment tucked between a board call and a dinner with investors, as if ending our marriage was one more line item to manage before lunch. I stood there in the driveway for a long time, the bin handle still in my hand, feeling something settle inside me that wasn't quite grief. It was clarity. I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about that because there's no version of this story where I stormed into his office and demanded answers. That was never who I was, and it was never going to serve me. Instead, I went upstairs that night, opened the fireproof box I kept in the back of our closet, and read through documents I hadn't looked at in over 2 decades. Papers from the earliest days of the company, papers with my signature on them, and Dean's, though he'd barely glanced at the pages before signing. Papers our first attorney, a careful man named Arthur Voss, had helped me draft when Dean was too busy chasing investors to worry about boring legal formalities, as he called them. I closed the box and sat on the edge of our bed for a long time that night, watching the man I'd built an empire with sleep soundly beside me, already dreaming, I imagined, of a future that didn't include me. He had no idea what those papers said. He'd never had any idea. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the woman standing in someone else's shadow. I felt like a woman who had simply been waiting for the right moment to step into the light. He filed 3 weeks later. The process that followed would try to convince the entire world that I was a woman about to lose everything. They had no idea what I already owned. Dean didn't waste any time. Within a week of that quiet appointment, I'd stumbled across on his calendar. Papers arrived at the house by courier, delivered to my hands like an invoice for a marriage that had run its course. He'd hired Whitfield and Cross, the most aggressive divorce firm in the city, the kind of firm that advertised on billboards along the interstate with slogans about protecting what's yours. I remember standing in the foyer reading the filing, feeling strangely calm, the way you feel calm in the eye of a storm you've been watching approach for days. The press got hold of it almost immediately. Someone on Dean's side must have leaked it because by the following Monday a business blog ran a piece titled "Tech Titan Dean Ramsay Files for Divorce," complete with a photo of me from a charity gala years earlier, smiling in a green dress, captioned simply as his wife. Not co-founder, not architect of the company's early financial strategy. Just his wife, as if that were the whole of what I'd built. The narrative wrote itself after that, the way narratives do when nobody bothers to check the facts. Homemaker marries ambitious entrepreneur. Entrepreneur builds empire. Wife enjoys the fruits of his labor for 2 decades, then gets left behind when the marriage grows stale. I read the comments on those articles some nights, alone in the guest room I'd started sleeping in. And I let people believe whatever they needed to believe. There was no version of the truth I could type into a comment box that would undo 22 years of a story Dean had been telling alone on magazine covers and stages and interviews, where I was never once mentioned by name. The board reacted the way boards react to convenient stories, with relief. I heard through a longtime assistant, a woman named Carol who'd worked reception since the garage days and still slipped me a sympathetic look whenever we crossed paths, that several directors had privately celebrated the idea that the divorce would resolve cleanly, with Dean retaining full operational control and the personal matter, as they called it, fading quietly into the background. Nobody asked what my role at the company had actually been. Nobody thought to ask because Dean had spent years making sure that question never occurred to anyone. Dean genuinely believed, that I would take a settlement, sign whatever his lawyers put in front of me, and disappear into some quiet second act far from the company we'd built. He told a mutual friend at a dinner party, this got back to me the way everything eventually gets back to you, that he expected me to want to move on and not drag this out. He wasn't being cruel exactly. He simply couldn't imagine that I might want something other than to vanish gracefully. What Dean never understood, what he had never bothered to understand in over 2 decades of marriage, was corporate structure. He hated the paperwork side of the business. He always had. In the earliest days, when we were incorporating Ramsay Technologies out of that cramped garage with the leaking roof, I was the one who sat across from Arthur Voss for hours, going through clause after clause while Dean paced outside on his phone, closing deals, making promises, building the version of himself he wanted the world to see. I remember Arthur looking up at me once during those sessions, pushing his glasses up his nose, and saying, "Mrs. Ramsay, most people don't think this carefully about worst-case scenarios when they're this excited about a beginning." I told him I'd learned a long time ago that excitement doesn't protect you from anything. My mother had lost everything in a divorce when I was a teenager, blindsided by finances she never understood because she'd never been allowed to understand them. I promised myself, sitting in her kitchen at 16 years old, watching her cry over bank statements, that it would never happen to me. Not like that. Not ever. So when we incorporated the company, I insisted on several provisions that seemed at the time almost absurdly cautious. Clauses about fiduciary conduct, clauses about executive misconduct and shareholder protections. A clause buried on page 14 of a document Dean signed, without reading past the signature line, that addressed what would happen to certain ownership structures in the event of a marital dissolution. Arthur drafted it all with a care I don't think Dean ever appreciated, because Dean never once asked to see it again after that first signing. Not in 22 years. I never mentioned those documents to anyone after that. Not to Dean, not to friends, not even to my own attorney until the divorce proceedings began, and I finally pulled the folder from the fireproof box in my closet and drove it to her office myself. Her name was Renata Cole, a sharp, soft-spoken woman I'd hired quietly away from any firm connected to Dean's circle, someone who wouldn't feel the need to report back to anyone at the company. I watched her face change as she read through the original incorporation papers, watched her set down her coffee cup slowly, watched her look up at me with an expression somewhere between astonishment and respect. "Felicia," she said carefully, "do you understand what you're sitting on?" I told her I did. I'd understood it for over 2 decades. I simply hadn't needed it until now. She asked me why I'd never used any of this leverage before. Why I'd let Dean take so much credit, let the board sideline me, let the press paint me as nothing more than the woman standing beside him in old photographs. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered. The truth was, I never wanted to win by force. I had wanted for a very long time for Dean to simply remember what we'd built together, to say my name in a boardroom the way he used to say it in that garage back when neither of us had anything and both of us had everything. He never did remember. And so, sitting in Renata's office that afternoon, I finally let go of waiting for him too. The ruling came down on a Thursday, and by Friday night, Dean was already celebrating. He rented out the top floor of the Meridian Club downtown, the same venue where we'd once hosted our 10th anniversary party, string lights and all, and filled it instead with executives, board members, and a jazz trio he'd flown in from Chicago. I heard about it from Carol, who called me that evening, sounding almost apologetic, like she felt obligated to warn me before I saw it splashed across social media. Dean had introduced his girlfriend that night. Her name was Bianca, 29 years old, a marketing consultant Ramsay Technologies had hired the previous spring. He walked her through that room on his arm like a trophy he'd finally been allowed to claim. And the board members, the same men and women who'd sat across from me at strategy meetings for 15 years, raised their glasses to him without a flicker of hesitation. I wasn't angry when I heard about it. I want to be honest about that because anger would have been easy, and easy wasn't what I needed right then. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more useful: confirmation. Dean believed the story was over. He believed he had cleanly walked away with the company, the house, the name on the door, and a younger woman on his arm as proof that his best years were still ahead of him. That confidence, that particular flavor of certainty that comes from a man who has never once been told, no, was exactly what I needed him to feel. While Dean toasted his own reflection, I was 3 miles away in a conference room with 2 forensic accountants named Priya Malhotra and Sam Ostersky. People Renata had recommended after quietly vetting a dozen firms with no ties whatsoever to Ramsay Technologies. We met after hours in a rented office space above a dry cleaner, because I didn't want a single soul inside that company to know what we were building until it was finished. What we found didn't surprise me so much as it saddened me in the particular way that watching someone destroy themselves slowly always saddens you, even when you know they deserve the consequences coming for them. Over the past 4 years, Dean had approved a string of executive expenses that never should have cleared internal review. A private jet lease routed through a shell entity. Home renovations on a lake house billed as a corporate retreat. Consulting fees paid to a company that turned out to be owned by Bianca's brother. None of it was hidden particularly well. Dean had never needed to hide anything because for years nobody with real oversight had bothered to look. Priya found something else, something that made even her pause during one of our late-night reviews. A pattern of shareholder disclosure violations stretching back nearly 3 years. Material information about a failed product line that Dean had kept from the board entirely, protecting his own bonus structure at the expense of investors who trusted him. Sam found compensation approvals Dean had pushed through for 2 executives, whose records showed they had personal relationships with him that were never disclosed as conflicts of interest. I never touched a single company system that wasn't already available to me through legitimate channels. I want that understood clearly because I know how these stories can sound when you're on the outside looking in, like some elaborate act of sabotage, some vengeful woman digging through her husband's secrets out of spite. It wasn't like that. Every document we assembled came from corporate records I was legally entitled to review as a founding shareholder. Records that had simply been buried under years of Dean's assumption that no one would ever bother to look. It took 6 weeks to build the file properly. 6 weeks of quiet meetings, of driving to that rented office after dark, of sitting across from Priya and Sam while they walked me through spreadsheets that told a story Dean had never imagined anyone would read. There were nights I sat in my car afterward in the empty parking lot beneath a single flickering street lamp and let myself feel the full weight of what I was looking at. Not triumph, not yet, but something closer to grief. This was still the man I had loved. Once, the man who used to fall asleep on our garage floor, surrounded by blueprints, too excited about the future to make it upstairs to bed. Some part of me had hoped for a long time that this evidence would never need to see daylight. But hope isn't a strategy. And Dean had made his choice the moment he blocked me out of the very company I'd helped build. The moment he decided the truth could simply be edited out of the story as long as he controlled the microphone. Once the file was complete, Renata reached out through proper channels to 2 independent board members, women who had grown increasingly uneasy about Dean's judgment over the past year, but lacked the documentation to act on their instincts. Within days, an emergency confidential session was scheduled, closed to the public, closed to the press, closed, most of all, to Dean himself. He had no idea it was happening. He was still riding high off his engagement announcement to Bianca, still convinced the hardest chapter of his life was safely behind him. He had absolutely no idea what was coming for him in that boardroom, or how quickly the empire he thought was, finally, permanently his would begin slipping through his fingers. Let me take you back to where I started this story. The courthouse steps, the cold morning air, Dean's shadow falling over me like it had 100 times before. "Don't ever set foot in my house again," he said, and I watched the cameras drink it in, watched the reporters angle their phones for the perfect shot of the broken wife on the losing end of a very public divorce. Dean's attorney stood just behind his shoulder, practically beaming. Bianca waited by the car, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, already scrolling through her phone as if this was simply another item on Dean's morning schedule. I let him have his moment. I have always believed that people reveal the truest parts of themselves in moments they think they've already won. And Dean, standing there on those steps with his chin lifted, and his voice pitched for an audience, was showing the world exactly who he'd become. Not the boy who used to fall asleep over blueprints in a garage that smelled like motor oil and instant coffee, but a man who needed an audience to feel like a victory counted. "Actually," I said, and I let the words sit there for a moment before I continued, because I wanted him to hear the calm in my voice before he understood what it meant. "This house is mine now." He laughed, not a cruel laugh exactly, more the reflexive laugh of a man who assumes he's misheard something absurd. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Renata had prepared, a plain manila folder that looked almost comically unremarkable for what it contained, and held it out to him. "What is this?" he said. Not really a question, more an irritated dismissal, the tone he used to use with junior employees who interrupted his lunch. "Read it. You should have read it 22 years ago too, but I understand you were busy." He opened it there on the courthouse steps in front of the reporters, in front of Bianca, in front of his own attorney, because his pride wouldn't let him wait until he was somewhere private to find out what a woman he'd already dismissed could possibly have to show him. I watched his eyes move across the first page, a transfer of title on our marital residence, dated and notarized weeks earlier, executed under a provision from our original property agreement that predated the divorce filing entirely. I watched his jaw tighten as he flipped to the second page, a board resolution. His hands, I noticed, had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man whose body understands something his mind hasn't caught up to yet. The third page was the emergency executive vote, dated 2 days prior, signed by 7 of 9 board members. The fourth page confirmed ownership restructuring based on preferred share protections activated by findings of executive misconduct. The fifth page, the one his attorney finally lunged forward to grab out of his hands, as though snatching it away could somehow undo what Dean had already read, was a formal notice of his removal as Chief Executive Officer of Ramsay Technologies, effective immediately, pending further investigation into the financial irregularities outlined in the attached appendix. "This isn't possible," Dean said. His voice had lost the pitch he'd used for the cameras. It had gone thin, almost boyish, and for just a moment I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not yet, but genuine bewilderment, the look of a man watching the ground shift beneath feet that had never once doubted their footing. I watched his attorney work through the stages of realization that Renata had warned me he would go through. Disbelief, then scrutiny, then the slow sinking understanding that everything in that folder had been executed with such precision that there was nothing left to challenge. "This isn't possible," Dean said again, quieter this time. More to himself than to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. 22 years of being underestimated had taught me that the quietest sentence in the room is often the one people remember longest. "You should have read what you signed." Dean did not go quietly. He sued first, of course. Within days of the emergency board session, his attorneys filed motions challenging the validity of the original incorporation documents, arguing the provisions were outdated, improperly executed, or simply too obscure to hold up under modern corporate law. Renata had anticipated this. Every filing Dean's team submitted, we'd already prepared a response for, because Arthur Voss, meticulous even in retirement, had kept immaculate records of every signature, every witness, every Nuttawazutpun from the very beginning. The judge dismissed Dean's first motion within 2 weeks. His attorneys filed an appeal. That too went nowhere because there was nothing ambiguous about documents Dean himself had signed, however carelessly, more than 2 decades earlier. He called in favors next. I heard about this the way I heard about most things during that period, through Carol, who still worked reception and still, out of some loyalty I never fully understood but was deeply grateful for, kept me informed of the mood inside the building. Dean called former board members he'd once golfed with, investors he'd wined and dined at conferences, executives he'd personally promoted over the years. Most of them, Carol told me, didn't return his calls. The ones who did offered polite, non-committal sympathy and nothing more. Investors, it turns out, care far more about stability than loyalty, and nothing about Dean's unraveling suggested stability. The forensic findings had already begun circulating in whispered form through the industry, and no one wanted to be seen standing too close to a man under active investigation for fiduciary misconduct. The employees surprised me the most, though perhaps they shouldn't have. In the weeks after I stepped in as interim CEO, I made a point of walking the floors myself, something Dean had stopped doing years earlier, back when he decided his time was better spent in boardrooms and green rooms than among the people actually building the products that made the company worth anything. I remembered names. I remembered the engineer, a soft-spoken man named Julian Raz, who'd once told me in the early days that he'd taken a pay cut to join us because he believed in what we were building. I remembered the operations manager, Deborah Cum, who'd worked through 2 pregnancies without ever once being offered adequate leave, because Dean had quietly stripped down the benefits program years earlier to improve quarterly numbers before a shareholder meeting. Several executives, once I was back in a position to actually listen, admitted things to me they would never have said to Dean directly. One senior director, a careful, guarded man named Turunsa Watluk, who'd been with the company almost as long as I had, told me during a private meeting that he'd flagged compliance concerns about certain expense approvals nearly 3 years earlier and been quietly told to let it go. I should have pushed harder, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I told him most people in his position wouldn't have pushed at all. He didn't seem comforted by that. And honestly, I wasn't trying to comfort him. I was trying to understand exactly how long this pattern had been allowed to grow unchecked, and how many people had watched it happen in silence the same way I once had. I saw Dean once unexpectedly on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a small grocery store near the edge of town, the kind of place neither of us would have set foot in during our years of catered dinners and private chefs. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in some quieter way. The confidence that used to fill every room he entered was now noticeably absent. Bahunka was not with him. I never asked, and Carol never volunteered exactly what had happened there, though I suspect a man under federal investigation with dwindling assets holds considerably less appeal than a rising tech visionary once did. We stood there for a moment in the produce aisle, an absurdly ordinary setting for a conversation that had been 2 decades in the making. He looked at me for a long time before he finally spoke. "Was all of this your plan?" he asked. His voice didn't carry the sharpness it once had. It sounded more than anything genuinely curious, like a man finally willing to ask a question he'd spent months avoiding. I thought about how to answer that honestly because I owed him honesty. Even now, even after everything, the truth was more complicated than the story people wanted to believe. More complicated even than the story I sometimes told myself on the hardest nights. "No," I said, and I meant it completely. My plan was for us to build something together. I let that sit between us for a moment, watching something shift behind his eyes, some recognition maybe of the years we'd actually spent as partners before ambition and applause slowly convinced him he'd done it alone. I didn't feel the need to say anything else. There was no triumphant final line I wanted to deliver, no last blow to land. I simply turned, picked up the bag of oranges I'd come in for, and walked toward the register, leaving him standing there among the vegetables with a question I suspect he'll be sitting with for a very long time. Rumsa Technologies is stronger now than it's been in years. The employees who stayed through the hardest months tell me the culture feels different, steadier, more honest. Julian Raz was promoted to lead engineering last spring. Deborah Cum now sits on the executive team, helping oversee the very benefits program Dean once quietly dismantled. I don't run every meeting. I don't need to control every decision because I finally trust the people around me to build something lasting. The same way I once trusted a young man in a garage who, for a while at least, deserved that trust. Sometimes revenge isn't destroying someone's life. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let them rewrite the truth about who built it in the first place. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that quiet strength outlasts arrogance every single time. Patience isn't weakness. Preparation isn't paranoia. And the greatest victory available to any of us isn't watching someone else fall. It's reclaiming your own dignity and choosing, even after everything, not to let bitterness be the thing that defines what comes next.